My name is Hal Roth. I'm director of the Contemplative Studies Initiative. If you haven't yet heard about us, we actually have a concentration. Formal undergraduate concentration in North America in Contemplative Studies. If any students here who would like to learn more about us, we have a website. Actually, anybody who wants to learn more about us, we have a website. And it contains lots of information about the concentration. It contains videos of past lectures. Most of our videos now are recorded and put up online digitally. Statements by our concentrators. To this point, we've been able to advise 16 independent concentrators, 2 of whom are sitting in this row here, Juan and Chloe. If you want to learn more about independent concentrations and contemplative studies, or about contemplative studies from a student perspective, please corral them after the lecture. What we do is we study human contemplative experience across cultures and across time from humanistic, scientific, and artistic points of view. The concentration focuses on the humanistic and the scientific. And we also encourage students to develop their own first-person contemplative practice. We incorporate first-person contemplative teaching in a critical way into the classroom, and we balance it off with third-person and second-person, and even what we're starting to call no-person experience in the classroom setting. We have a very active series of lectures and retreats during the year. This is our last formal lecture of the year. Coming up next semester, we will have in February a performance of the classical Indian dance called Kirtan. In March, one of the co-founders of the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts, Joseph Goldstein, will be here to give a lecture and to lead a workshop. In March 12th and 13th, Friday and Saturday. We'll also have Louis Kamyathy, who is a Taoist priest and a professor of Taoist studies at University of San Diego, who will be here to give the Interlandi lecture. This is the 11th annual Interlandi Memorial Lecture. There will be a Sunday retreat and a Monday lecture, and that will be set up in one of the weekends in April. And we'll end the year with a lecture by Richie Davidson, one of the leading neuroscientists who works on contemplative practices from the University of Wisconsin. That'll be on April 29th. So I think since I'm not a scientist, nor should I even attempt to imitate a scientist, I am going to introduce one of our contemplative studies scientists, Dr. Catherine Kerr, who will introduce our speaker for this evening. Catherine.
So, Kyle Desbordes is somebody I've known since I think around 2009. She is originally trained as an engineer, and she has been an important member of numerous collaborations up at Mass General Hospital. So I've worked with her in collaboration with Dr. Sarah Azar, and she was part of a group of us, and Gaelie actually was the leader, basically, of the group that tried to take a Buddhist theory of equanimity and develop it as an outcome measure in cognitive science. So that gives you a sense of her range, that she can work back and forth from pretty textual work in Buddhist studies to all the way to very arcane signal processing and computational coding. So she covers the waterfront, and her actual engineering knowledge is pretty intense. And I have to warn you, she's presenting on compassion, which she thinks is the important ingredient in numerous practices, including mindfulness. But I have to warn you that she is a tough-minded woman. And as an engineer, she is like a no bullshit scientist, and I think you would probably agree with me. She's the first, in a meeting of people who are flapping their jaws, she's the one who calls bullshit. So, without further ado.
That's a great skill.
Well, thank you, Kathy, for this
introduction, and I invite everyone to call bullshit on what I'm presenting to, because that's how science is done and that's how it gets better. So please feel free, but also to interrupt me with questions or anything if something's not clear. I might not be able to see you very well because of the light, so make sure you make yourself visible if you want to raise your hand or something. So I'm going to be presenting a number of studies I've been involved with regarding compassion meditation. So I'm going to unpack what that means, but basically meditative practices that are specifically targeted at increasing compassion. And so I'm going to start with a simple example that hopefully will give you a sense of what we're talking about here. So when we think compassionate behavior, what do we mean? And how do we study that scientifically? So there's different approaches to this. One of them is to look at compassionate response to suffering. So imagine that you're sitting in a waiting area, for example, and then you see somebody coming in on crutches. What are you going to do? And most of us, been taught as young children that the right thing to do is to give up your seat to that person, right? But how many of us actually do this every time, all the time? So that's one thing that can be measured, how much people are willing to do this. And then after having trained in meditation, does that change? Are people more likely to give up their seat in response to this type of situation, for example? So that's one way to measure compassionate behavior before and after, for example, a meditation training. So I'm going to present a study in which we did that, but to add a little bit of complexity to it, instead of just one person waiting in a waiting room like this, the subject of our study was actually sitting among two other people who were Confederates. So unbeknownst to them, to the study participant who's sitting among them, the two other people are actually accomplices of the experimenters. And what they do is that they sit there and they just play on their cell phones or look busy, and they purposely ignore the person commenting on crutches, who is also a Confederate. And so our empirical question was, are the study participants going to get up and give their seats or not? And then, of course, afterwards, we debriefed people and told them they had just been deceived by this situation, and we were actually measuring them. But at the time, they didn't know. They thought they were just waiting for the next part of the study to go on. So what we found was very interesting. And this was published in a paper last year. So the title kind of gives it away. Meditation increases compassionate responses to suffering. What happened is that overall, only 1 in 3 people was actually giving up their seat in this situation, which some people thought when there was some press coverage of the study that this may be a Boston thing, that people around here may be less courteous. Especially a reader in the New York Times wrote an angry letter saying, well, if you had done this study in the South, 100% of people would have given up their seats. So that would be a good thing to replicate, right? But so here in Boston, we started with a pretty low baseline. And in fact, when you look at the two different groups, comparing people who had just done an 8-week training in meditation, compared to a control group that had never meditated before, there was a huge difference. In the people who had never meditated before, only 1 in 6 gave up their seats. Whereas in the ones that had practiced meditation, 1 in 2, which is still, not 100%, there's still room for improvement there, but that was a 5 times increase in likelihood of giving up their seats. So this is one example of how one can study compassion scientifically and then test the effects of meditation training in that kind of context. So here, what I didn't tell you is that there were actually 2 different groups of meditation that people were randomized to. One of them was a type of mindfulness meditation training, and one of them was actually compassion meditation training. And in this study, there was no difference between these 2 groups. both groups, after the 8-week training, half of the participants gave up their seats. So there was no difference in this case. But because of the small number of participants in this small study, we can't really conclude from that both types of meditation are necessarily the same or have the same effect, but just that in this study we weren't able to detect a difference between them. So I'm gonna then get to explaining a little bit more what we mean by compassion outside of this kind of simple example. So, so what is compassion? The field of compassion research is recent and is still growing, and there's a lot of debates as to even defining our terms correctly. So here's just one definition that I find helpful and that we use in our research, but even that one is still a topic of debate and not everyone would necessarily agree on that. But in my perspective, I feel like this is a good starting point. And compassion in this case is the feeling that arises in witnessing another's suffering and that motivates a subsequent desire to help. So there's two components to it. One is how seeing someone suffering makes you feel, and then the second is, are you willing to act upon that? Is there an action? So this is different from empathy. Empathy really just means the vicarious experience of another's emotions. So if you see someone who's happy and then you feel happy, that's a form of empathic resonance. If you see someone who's really scared and then you become scared without even knowing what that person is scared of, that's also empathy, but in a sense that may or may not be really beneficial, because maybe it could be called emotional, empathetic distress. So you see someone in distress and then you become distressed. So then now you have two people in distress, so who's going to help them? So there's a distinction here between empathy and compassion, that empathy is just mirroring someone else's emotions, and that may or may not be helpful. Whereas compassion, there's supposed to be an element of it that's good, because you acknowledge someone is suffering, but you also have your own perspective on it that enables you to help them. So, so that's the starting point of this type of research. There's another interesting aspect to compassion, is that it connects us to other people. So it involves orienting to the person who's suffering, approach-related behavior. So instead of running away because you're either scared or you don't know what to do, you feel willing to engage with the suffering person. And that also includes oneself. So one important aspect of compassion is called self-compassion, which is compassion for oneself, for one's own suffering. And so in this case, the approach-related aspect to it would be the willingness to look into your own suffering, to really be present to it and to not run away from it. So all these aspects of compassion are presumably important and the topic of different types of investigations that we can pursue. So, so then, if compassion is beneficial in that way, is it possible to cultivate it, and why would one want to do that? So, cultivating compassion can be an active commitment to help oneself and others. In the context of people involved with caregiving, it could potentially also help with reducing their compassion fatigue and burnout by giving them a more healthy approach to compassion and compassionate behavior. Also, the hypothesis in this type of research is that compassion can actually increase one's own mental and physical health, level of happiness, and perhaps more deeply a sense of meaning in life. So these are all empirical questions. It's the kinds of claims that have been made by contemplative traditions, for example. But now we come to the point when we can study this empirically and design studies that test, is it true or not, that if you cultivate compassion through specific techniques, you're going to get these types of benefits or not. And maybe who is going to benefit more? Is it true that caregivers who benefit from it, and et cetera, et cetera. So as I mentioned, this field is currently in a growth phase, and there's a lot of recent work that's really interesting. Here I'm referencing a few of major references that, if you're interested in this topic, are worth looking into, because they're a good summary of where the field is at so far and some theoretical considerations of what can be investigated and what has been done so far. So the first one is by Paul Gilbert, who's a psychotherapist in the UK, and he wrote several books actually on the topic of compassion, especially in the context of psychotherapy. So I highly recommend his work. And this book that I mentioned here, Compassion, Conceptualizations, Research and Use in Psychotherapy, is like an edited volume with multiple collaborators who look at different aspects of this. And it's his method is largely inspired from Buddhism, and he describes how that came to be in his books. The second one I mentioned here is a paper that was published a few years ago, from which I took the previous definition of compassion versus empathy. So it's a good working document to explain compassion from an evolutionary perspective, and also like empirical science in general. Then there's this book from last year by Tanya Singer, which is also an edited volume. This book is freely available as an ebook, and it's called Compassion, Building Practice in Science. It has many chapters with many contributors from this field of compassion science, some from science, like myself and what I'm going to present today, some from social science, and some from religious studies. So it's also a great snapshot of where the field is at right now. And then there's been a couple of conferences on this topic that you can also look up. So now that we've seen that it may be helpful to cultivate compassion, like how do we do that? What's available? What have people tried to do to date? So most of the research has been on practices derived from Buddhism, and in particular specific meditation techniques that for research have been made secular. So the religious aspects have been kind of taken away, and these practices have been made basically compatible with people's worldviews coming from any kind of background. And the main ideas around these practices is, first of all, to develop self-compassion, as I mentioned earlier, care for oneself and one's own suffering, which is a necessary first step. It's the same idea as the oxygen mask. You have to put on your own mask first before you can help others. And here it's the same idea. You can't really be efficient in having compassion for other people if you don't start from having compassion for yourself. So that's a central tenet of all these techniques. And then the second theme is to recognize that all people also experience suffering that's similar to your own. So feeling a sense of connectedness and similarity across people, and perhaps even across animals and maybe even the planet. So, and then the third element is to develop a sense of connection through common humanity and experiences with suffering. So these are the steps that these trainings go through. And then at the end, there has to be a wish to reduce suffering. So it's not enough to become aware of the suffering, feel connected to others, and then stop there. So these trainings typically will end at a point where people are asked to change things in their lives to actually reduce suffering. So here are a few of the different types of compassion training programs that exist right now. This is a small sample of those that I think are the most significant, but there's many, and there's a growing number of them. So I'm just going to mention these because I think they're more significant. So the first one is by John McCransky, and it's described in his book called Awakening to Love, Unveiling Your Deepest Goodness. It's based on Tibetan Buddhism, especially from the Dzogchen tradition. And he has a method for teaching Tibetan Buddhist practices in a secular format, and has done this with a number of caregiver populations, people in prisons, educators, like thousands of people have received this type of training, but there hasn't been a lot of research on it yet. So I'm just throwing that out in case any one of you guys want to start collaborating with John Merkransky. I know he's looking for this type of collaboration, and he's currently, is he involved with Mind and Life on like a...
Yes, the education program he was an advisor.
So anyway, so that's one program that's out there. The other one I mentioned earlier is Paul Gilbert's work. So he calls it compassion-focused therapy. So this is more like a type of psychotherapy on a one-on-one basis. So one therapist, one patient. But there's variants in which it can also be group intervention and so on. So there's also a growing research on this method. Then there's a program called Compassion Cultivation Training, which was developed at Stanford University and has been used in a few populations, including people suffering from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and also veterans. And there's just a couple of research articles on it so far that have been published, but they're trying to do more research on that. And then the last one that I want to mention is cognitively based compassion training, developed at Emory University, and now also used at University of Arizona, but also in places like Brazil, Spain, and so on. And I'm going to focus on this one because it just happens to be the one that I used in my research. But I just want to say that I'm not partial to it. I think all of these different interventions have different features and different qualities to them. So just that more research is needed on all of these different types of practices. So I'm going to go a little bit more in detail into the CBCT program, so that gives you a sense of what people actually do when they receive this training. So this one was designed by Geshe Lobsang Tenzin Negi, who is himself a former Tibetan monk. So he's Tibetan, and he used to be a monk and a Geshe, which is the highest degree in the Gelug school of Tibetan Buddhism. And then he's now a professor at Emory University in religious studies, and designed this program, CBCT, originally at the request of students on campus. A few years ago at Emory, there was a wave of several suicides on campus. And the students were really struggling and approached him asking for help for some kind of method for coping with the situation and with the stress that students experience on campus. And so he took his own training in Tibetan practices called Lojong, which means mind training, and just made them secular and adapted them into an 8-week program. And he started teaching that to students on campus. And it was 2 hours a week with him as the instructor, and also they did some group practice, they did some Q&A. And then they were also asked to try to keep practicing at home the practices that they learned in class, for example, 20 to 30 minutes a day. And so, when Geshe started teaching this, and he knew collaborators on campus who were interested in researching meditation, they thought, well, we should have a pilot study seeing how this type of class actually affects the students. Does that help them with stress? And in particular, they were interested in psychosocial stress, which is the stress people experience in social interactions. So I'm going to present a pilot study that they did at the time to test the effects of this type of intervention. But so before I show you the data, I want to walk you through the different steps of this training. So there's 8 steps, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what each of them entails. So the first stage is called developing attention and stability of mind. And so this is common to a lot of meditation training programs, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. It's basically teaching people how to focus attention on their breath, when they get distracted, coming back to the breath, and then keeping doing that until the mind settles down a little bit and there's a sense of calm and presence that develops. So they first learn these basic meditative techniques for the first week. And then every practice will start like that and end like that, but every week they're going to add a different ingredient that's more specifically about compassion. So for example, the second week, they start noticing their own suffering, really, even though it's not presented that way. It's they're taught to cultivate insight into their own mental experience, their own emotions, everything that's going through their body and mind. And the idea is to get them some familiarity with their inner space, and in particular with their own suffering. Then in the third week, they start practices for cultivating self-compassion. So they will reflect, like have contemplations on the idea that everyone wants to be happy and free from suffering. And then notice which mental events in themselves contribute to feeling more happy and which ones actually make them feel worse. And so then they're also invited to make a determination to emerge from the toxic mental and emotional states that promote unhappiness and to cultivate those that are more conducive to happiness. So those of you familiar with Buddhism will recognize this step as renunciation, but this step is not described in these terms because that would be a Buddhist concept. So here it's just described as making the wish to be free from suffering and from the mental patterns that make it worse, basically. Then in the fourth week, people are taught practices for equanimity. So they contemplate the fact that we have these categories of friends, enemies, and strangers, and that they're actually very arbitrary, that people in our lives can move from one category to another. One who used to be a friend suddenly becomes an enemy, et cetera, et cetera. And so they come to understand that this is not really the truth of the being of these people, and that what we all share in common is wanting to be happy and free from suffering. So this step is to develop equanimity. Then the next step is to develop appreciation and gratitude for others. So the idea being to acknowledge how much we benefit from other people in everything in life, and even the small things. So there's the sense of being independent is really an illusion. So people reflect on the fact that everything that they benefit from, the clothes they wear, the food they eat, comes from the work of countless other people who have contributed to it one way or another. And whether they did that with a generous attitude or not, in the end, we do benefit from that. So it's this type of reflection and cultivating a sense of gratitude for that and a sense of appreciation. And then in the sixth week, based on this recognition, reflecting on the drawbacks of being selfish and self-centered, and reflecting on how the kindness of others and the gratitude that we feel for them can transform into a sense of endearment and loving kindness for other people. So that stage is more like an affective cultivation, like really feeling this kind of warm-heartedness towards others based on having recognized how much we depend on them for things and the gratitude we have for them. Then in the seventh week, it's called wishing and aspirational compassion. The idea is to then again focus on suffering specifically, and feeling that all these beings that we're connected to in one way or another, they experience suffering, and from that space of having loving kindness for them, then having a sense of compassion for their suffering and the wish for them to be free from suffering. And then the final week is active compassion. So how do we, based on this sense of compassion for others' suffering, do things in our lives to change that? Like, what can we do to actually commit to assist others in their pursuit of happiness and being free from suffering, and so on? So you see that there's actually a lot of material here, and 8 weeks may or may not be enough actually for people to really digest all of that and really make all these changes in their perception of the world, perception of people, and their life. So we're not sure if 8 weeks is really the right format, actually, and this also is a little bit of an empirical question. Would the program benefit from being stretched over a longer period, like 10 or 12 weeks, or 6 months, or a year, or, but the 8 weeks format was chosen as a very simple basis of comparison with other programs, and then see where it gets. But it should not be necessarily, you shouldn't see that as a fixed duration necessarily. This was just a starting point, and it may be the case that it takes more time. So I will get back to that point later. So, as I mentioned, one of the first studies they did with CBCT was a pilot study on college students at Emory University, and in particular, looking at how this type of training affects response to stress. So, because the team involved was Dr. Chuck Rizon and Dr. Tad Pace, who are experts in psychophysiology and inflammation in particular, they looked at the effect of this training on inflammation response to stress in the laboratory. So how did they do that? They used what's called the Trier Social Stress Test, which is a very standard laboratory stressor. And the way it's set up is that the participant is brought in front of a panel of so-called experts in behavioral analysis, and they're told that these people will scrutinize everything they do and say and their expressions and everything. And their task is to give a short speech, which is in the format of a job interview or like a job talk, which they know it's not a real job, of course, but still, just this setup is enough to really stress people, because these three experts are trained to be extremely unfriendly. So as the participant starts talking, these people are just like frowning or even looking away, looking bored, rolling their eyes, or being non-responsive. And then the main person who's driving in say, okay, you can start now. And then just, giving them a hard time, basically. And then unbeknownst to them, after they're done with this, which is only a few minutes, the participants are then asked on the spot to do some mental arithmetic. And it's really hard. It's like 13,075 minus 13, go, go, go. And every time they make a mistake, again, the experimenter looks like kind of annoyed and like, okay, let's get back to the beginning. And so this is a very strong stressor for most people. And it builds a lot of first anticipatory stress before they even start the task, just knowing what's coming. And then throughout the task, if you measure their heart rate, skin conductance, you can see that it really affects them. And what people have done is also to take blood samples throughout this period and for a couple hours afterwards to see what different markers of inflammation reveal about how people respond to this type of stress. So what you see typically, and here it was the case also in this subject, is that, for example, if you look at IL-6, which is an inflammatory cytokine, you see an increase over the course of the 90 minutes after the stressor. So this is like a typical response to this stressor. Interestingly, when you do this prior to meditation training, you see the typical response. When you do this after the meditation training, as a group, the students who did the meditation training were not significantly different from those who did not. But doing some further analysis, they found that not every student had actually been really compliant with the training. So some of them almost never showed up in class, never practiced at all, while some other ones that were really engaged and did a lot of it at home. So they subdivided subjects in low meditation practice versus high meditation practice. And then there was actually a strong difference between these two types of students. So you can see that after the meditation training, low practice individuals in white pretty much still had a very high inflammation level and response to the stressor, whereas those who were in the high practice category had less inflammation, essentially. Same thing with cortisol. So cortisol is a classic marker of stress and what you see typically with this Trier social stress test is that cortisol increases and peaks about 30 minutes after the stressor begins, and then it takes up to an hour and a half to go back down to normal. What happened with the people who trained in compassion meditation, again, there was a big difference between those who practiced a lot versus not much. And so those who didn't practice much still had the same kind of response as before, whereas those who did a lot of practice, as you can see, they still had the increase in cortisol during the stressor, and they reached pretty much a high level also after 30 minutes, but then it quickly went back down to baseline much faster. So this is really good, because even though this setup is very artificial and you can say, well, it's just a laboratory study, having this huge difference in cortisol response to stressor has potentially really strong effects in the long term. Because think of every time in your life when you have these kind of surge of stress, like you're driving, somebody cuts you off, you get anxious, or there's an exam coming or anything. Like in our current life, we're kind of constantly pushing this system a little bit. And what makes a difference between whether stress can be helpful or not, or healthy or not, is how you can recover from it. So the people who recover much faster from stressors tend to fare better. And there's other studies that show that. It's more adaptive to what they do, but it's also potentially better in the long run for health. Inflammation and chronically high levels of inflammation have been linked to many very serious diseases, including cardiovascular diseases, Alzheimer's disease, diabetes. There's a really long list, and there's actually even mortality differences between people who have high inflammation and low inflammation. So this is potentially a very important effect, that after only 8 weeks of training, people have a much healthier response to stressors. So, okay. Then, so that was one pilot study that they did with healthy students at Emory University. Then the question was, can this type of training help people who actually have experienced more serious stress in their life? So they looked at foster care adolescents who had experienced different kinds of trauma in their early life and who were still having a hard time. And they offered this intervention to them, and then also did some studies. So here you see one that was published recently, in which they looked at, they randomized these children to either the CBCT intervention or wait list. So these kids also got to do it, but afterwards. And they made it a 6-week intervention in this case. And they did a number of measures before and after. So they did some self-report questionnaires, saliva sampling for cortisol, and also for C-reactive protein, which is another marker for inflammation. Now, they only looked at baseline levels of these instead of doing the Trier social stress test, because in these kids, it wouldn't have been necessarily ethical to put them through yet another major stressor. So these were just baseline levels. And so what they found was, again, in the adolescents who really engaged with the practice more, there was an effect of practice time in reducing levels of CRP in saliva. So again, it's an inflammatory marker. So those who practiced more had a stronger decrease, basically, in CRP. Here you see the same data shown differently. So you have those who did a low amount of practice, as recorded in the self-reports, still had high levels of CRP after the intervention, whereas those who engaged in higher amounts of practice had a much, a pretty big decrease in CRP levels. So again, that's an interesting indication that even in populations that have suffered from potentially chronic stress and may have had, due to adversity, epigenetic differences compared to a healthy population, there is still a possibility that this type of intervention can make a difference. So, and finally, there was not just a physiological effect. When you measured people's levels of hopefulness, using Children's Hope Scale, there was an increase with the amount of practice sessions that they engaged in. So those who practiced more tended to have a stronger increase in hope, which is also a good sign. So based on these different pilot studies, my collaborators then designed a larger study of CBCT in hundreds of participants, this time people from the greater Atlanta region. And this study is still ongoing. We're still looking at the data, but because we measured some, we did some brain imaging on some of the subjects here, I'm able to show you some of this now because we had access to these data earlier. So I'm going to show you some results from this study, which is called the Compassion, Attention, Longitudinal Meditation Study. So this was a study of healthy adults, 25 to 55 years old. It was the 8-week intervention for 2 hours a week. But this time people were randomized to 3 different groups. So the first one was CBCT, Cognitively Based Compassion Meditation Training, like I described. But to make sure that the effects we saw were specific to compassion training as opposed to meditation training in general, or people just becoming more aware of their own feelings or having more mindfulness or more attention. There was one of the control groups was actually practicing only mindful attention meditation, and I'm going to describe a little bit more exactly what they did. And then there was a third group that was also an active control group that was based on health discussions. So those in the 2 meditation groups were asked to meditate 20 to 30 minutes every day. And that's it. So there was no other components to it. Unlike MBSR, there was no yoga, there was no dietary change. So all they did was this sitting meditation practice in class and at home. So in the mindful attention training group, this intervention was designed based on Alan Wallace's book, The Attention Revolution. So first, people, again, learn to settle the body respiration in their natural state, as they did in the compassion group, as I described, mindfulness of breathing, and then bringing a sense of relaxation, stability of attention, and vividness. And then later on, as the weeks went on, they then practiced mindfulness of mental events. So they turned their attention to the inner works of their mind. And then finally, what Alan calls awareness of awareness. So the process of being aware itself, making that the focus of the meditation, essentially. So, so this is closer to what people do in mindfulness meditation interventions, but it's also not exactly that, because this was really what's called shamatha in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, and following Alan Wallace's instructions. You'll notice that here there is absolutely nothing that's remotely connected to compassion or loving kindness or the 4 immeasurables in the Buddhist sense, which are usually part of what Alan teaches. So this intervention was really designed to control for the effects of pure meditative training. So it's not really an intervention in and of itself, because it's kind of a very constraint type of intervention. So I just want to make that clear, that this study was not comparing compassion meditation training with a mindfulness intervention, because a real mindfulness intervention will include some aspects of the compassion meditation training program. So here it's really meant to be as distinct as possible.
Question?
Yes?
For the 8-week thing, were the home practices guided in either one?
Yes, so for the home practices, that's a great question. We gave them audio recordings of the practice of the week, but they were free to use it or not, based on their own preference, and it was for 20 to 30 minutes.
I'm not that familiar with the cognitively based compassion training, and so the actual phenomenology or experience of it, where you're sitting for 20 minutes, are you doing something concrete, like a concrete practice, or are you just kind of holding in mind that people are like me? How do you operationalize that?
Yes, so that's a great question. So I described the 8 different steps of the program, and none of them is Tonglen. The program kind of stops short of teaching Tonglen, because it was considered it would take longer to get people to that stage. So it kind of prepares people in that direction. So when they contemplate other people's suffering, it's not synchronized to the breath. It's not in the sense of Tonglen. It's really just an analytical meditation, if you will.
So you might be visualizing, people that you've encountered.
Yes, exactly. So you would say, think of a stranger, for example. So you're like, think of the person you just met earlier today at the coffee shop. Imagine them, and their life. Imagine some difficulties they may be going through, and kind of reflect on that.
So it sounds a little more like a meta practice. Working on self.
So
expanding.
it definitely has elements similar to the meta practice, but there's really a stronger emphasis on suffering and compassion for suffering and how suffering connects all beings. Whereas metta would be more the loving kindness aspect, so feeling like we want everyone to be happy, but there's not a specific focus on suffering. So this can get pretty difficult, these practices of compassion meditation, because it forces people to face the stuff that they may have been trying to avoid their whole life, in themselves and in the people they know. So if you have someone in your family that has some kind of chronic condition or mental illness, and maybe you've just wanted to stay away from them, this practice will kind of invite you to look at that. And, it becomes the practice. So it's very, that's why 8 weeks may or may not be enough time, because it can get really, really deep. It's really involved in that sense. Okay, so so that was the shamatha group, and then we have the third group, which was health education course. So that was a standard course given at Emory, actually, for freshmen, teaching them health-related topics, how to have a healthy diet, how to exercise. So they would just receive these lectures, and the idea was that there would be group effects that they also meet every week with a group of people and an instructor, and expectation effects, like they think they're going to receive something out of it that is going to help them in their life. So those were meant to control for group and expectation effects in the other two interventions. But there's no meditation at all in this group. Okay, so we did some brain imaging, as I mentioned, and in the data I'm going to show now, it's a small sample of the study participants. We have 12 subjects in each of the 3 groups, and we did a number of different measures, but I'm going to focus now on doing some functional MRI in an emotional challenge task and see how they respond to that before and after the interventions. And also we had simultaneous recordings of autonomic measures that I will briefly mention. We did collect some structural, high-resolution structural and diffusion MRI. I might or might not show some of that. It's not published yet, so I'm happy to talk about it, but maybe offline or off the record. So in this task, it's a passive viewing of emotionally evocative images. So it's very simple. The subjects are asked to watch the images and let yourself react to them naturally. In particular, they are not instructed to meditate or to do any of the practices that they've learned in the course. So how do we do that? We don't tell them to do it, and then afterwards we ask them what they were doing, and we asked them, were you meditating? Were you trying to apply these techniques? And all of them said no. Some of them said, was I supposed to? And we said, no, that's good. So we didn't even want to mention it to not start them thinking about that. And also the experimenters were blind as to which group each subject was in. So I was one of the experimenters, and here's Eric Schwartz. And we received these subjects from Emory University without knowing which group they were in. So the images that were shown were photographs, all representing human beings in different situations, and some of them were positive, like happy, cheerful. Some of them were negative, so images of suffering, and some were neutral, so just ordinary situations. And they were presented in random order, and subjects never saw the same image twice. So we wanted to focus on the amygdala because It's one of the areas that are known to be implicated in emotional processing of both positive and negative images. So it's not just the fear center, as some people think. It's also very much activated during positive emotions. Basically, anything that is emotionally salient in your environment will activate the amygdala and kind of make you turn towards it or get your attention. So we were interested, especially because previous studies have found interesting effects in meditation, in people who meditate, either beginners or expert meditators, with the amygdala. So for example, during meditation, during mindful attention type of meditation, the amygdala response to emotional stimuli tends to decrease. So that was found in a couple studies, but people were asked to meditate. So what was unknown is whether these effects would carry on when people were not meditating, which is more relevant to ordinary life, when stuff happens and at that time you may not be in a state of meditation or willing to do it or what. So we wanted to see if these effects were also there beyond the formal meditation practice. So, so here I'm showing the amygdala response to these emotional images, and they're sorted into 3 different categories. You have positive images in green, negative images in red, and neutral images in gray. So pre to post in the control group, there was no significant change as expected. So you see that the amygdala responds more to positive and negative images and less so to neutral images. So good. These people had brains that responded the usual way, so that was good. No change in the control group. In the mindful attention meditation group, you'll see here that there's a global decrease, that the levels of amygdala activation before the training went down after the training. And yeah, and this was a significant reduction. Now, what happened in the cognitively based compassion training was interesting because we didn't know what to expect since there was no previous study really on this. And so we found something a little intriguing. We found that there was some kind of a decrease in response to positive images, maybe to neutral images, but not significant. It was very low to begin with. But in response to negative images, the ones in red, you see that, if anything, there's a slight increase. So it turned out that the effect was quite varied across subjects. Some subjects had a decrease, some subjects had an increase. It was a little bit all over the place. So we had to look into it more in detail and figure out what happened here. So we had another measure on these subjects, which was a self-report questionnaire measuring depression, using the Beck depression inventory. And so even though these subjects were healthy and were not clinically depressed or anything, there was a range of values in this score, and it changed a little bit from pre to post. And what we found is that in the compassion training group, here shown in blue, some people really had a strong decrease in depression. As you can see, these numbers went like minus 15 points. And those were the same people who also had an increase in the amygdala response to images of suffering. And if you look at the other group, the mindful attention training group in red, it's flat. So there was no such effect there in the sense that these people did not really experience much change in their depression score, and that was not linked at all to amygdala response. So how do we interpret this? So that's tricky, right? Because on its own, the data is what it is. So what we think is happening is that people who show an increase in amygdala response to suffering, it's like they become more emotionally activated in response to seeing other people suffering, which you may think is bad, because if it's just empathy, if it's just seeing other people suffer makes them suffer, then that's not good, right? But in this case, it was the opposite. It was those who had this increase also had a decrease in depression. So as if becoming more in tune with other people's suffering was associated with greater well-being for themselves. And this is actually consistent with what the contemplative traditions say, especially Buddhism, that there is a beneficial effect to oneself for being more compassionate, for being more aware of other people's suffering and willing to help them. So, this is several steps removed from the data. Okay, so this is really just a further hypothesis for future research. But we think that what's happening here is that you teach people to become more compassionate, to become more aware of other people's suffering, and they start having a stronger response to that shows in higher amygdala activation. But at the same time, it makes them feel more maybe in touch with their own values or increases meaning in their life. And when you measure depression using the usual assessments for that, they actually get better in that sense. So, to be continued. This is a small sample. These are not clinically depressed people. There's different ways maybe one could interpret that. But we think this is kind of encouraging. Yes, question?
What kind of pain matrix?
The pain matrix.
Yes. I can't remember exactly the names of that areas,
ACC and so on, yeah. So we did have a quick whole brain analysis of these data in addition to just looking at the amygdala. There was no significant change in other areas that came up at the whole brain level. However, there were other things that were happening in specific regions of interest. So I'm still looking at these data from different hypotheses. The pain matrix is one of interest because Tanya Singer, for example, has shown that empathy for others' pain activates the brain in a similar way as experiencing pain oneself. So there may be some interesting things there. In our case, they were not significant at the whole brain level. So if there's something here, it's a little bit more subtle. But that's a great question. Thank you. Any other? Yes?
Is it possible that what you're observing has to do with an increased sense of efficacy from the compassion training, that they have a sense of there's something they can do about it, they're not helpless?
That's a great point. And yes, it's definitely one possible mechanism that these interventions increase people's sense of confidence in their ability to help, or even just in their ability to remain in equanimity when they cannot help. Also, being present to another person's suffering, even if there's nothing you can do for them. For example, they're on their deathbed, you know they're going to die soon. There's nothing you can do. But just being able to stay present with that and be there with them is huge. And so that's part of the training, and that's, in the case of caregiving, that's the kind of thing that other investigators are looking at, these kinds of mechanisms. Yes, thank you. Yeah.
So one of the things that I'm thinking about is the use of the back. I mean, it doesn't.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to. It doesn't get really at what you're
Sure.
trying to get. I mean, depression.
Yeah.
That's kind of a different pot of potatoes in some ways. And,
Yes.
I love that question about could it be that they feel more able to be equanimous. And so it seems to me it's almost like equanimity and a sense of resiliency. I mean, that's in some ways what this is.
Yes.
Seems to be speaking to.
Yes.
And that sense rather than empathy, more sympathy.
Yeah.
Experience without taking.
That's a great point. And yes, more hypotheses for future mechanistic studies based on the
more
data.
measures.
Yeah. Now that we know, something happens in the amygdala, and then I'll show you other things in terms of physiology. And then a lot of data we're still analyzing. These people also underwent the same Trier social stress test. So we will have data on their resilience to that type of stress. Also some data in epigenetics. They had a full, so I don't know which ones in particular, but they looked at protein expression related also to inflammation, stress, that kind of thing. So these data are currently under study.
And are you again looking at inflammatory markers like interleukin-6?
Yes. So both the acute response to that with the Trier social stress test, and then yeah, baseline assessment. So we will hopefully put all these pieces together and see across all the people in the study if there's a picture that emerges in that sense. Yeah.
I'm wondering, I taught this in my cognitive neuroscience and meditation class, and I just love the amygdala finding.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know it's not definitive, it's still an exploratory finding, but it gives us a really interesting hypothesis about amygdala in different types of meditation. I wonder if you could just kind of say that for us again, or kind of thematize that, and what you might expect to see in the rest of the sample, or in terms of the inflammatory markers or something like that. Just like, because I think that the public and even neuroscientists are so ingrained to see the amygdala as
bad, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
As negative and fear.
Mm-hmm.
So can you just say a little bit more about that reinterpreting that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that increased amygdala activation on its own, you can't say whether it's a good or a bad thing. I think it has to be to fit with other aspects of the physiology. On its own, any brain area really going up or down is meaningless. It only makes sense in the context of a greater assessment, and between self-reports, physiological assessments, and also the task. What do you ask people to do? If you ask people to ignore the image, of course the amygdala response is going to go down. Like if you ask them to focus on their breath, for example, they're kind of distracting themselves away from the content of the image. So you could call that focused attention meditation, or you could call that distraction. Distraction away from what's in front of them. It's like, oh, I'm just going to focus on my breath and feel good. Well, is that the right thing to do always? Maybe in some cases. It's much more subtle than that. So it's good to learn techniques to calm oneself down, but it should also not come at the expense of being able to do something when facing suffering or situations that require to engage. So I think maybe that's one tricky aspect of the way that meditation has been portrayed, or or some people may think of it, maybe a little off, because it sounds like you're just retreating into your own little space and trying to make yourself feel better at the expense of what's going on around you, and that's really not the point. I mean, it shouldn't be if it's properly done. What's that?
They're coming to that.
Yes.
That's exactly what they want. They want to not feel.
But sometimes you have to start there. I mean, that's the other side of this, is like compassion. Like, I think you may find populations in which there will be a super strong response in the amygdala to other people suffering, but it's debilitating. In their case, it's not a good thing. It's that they completely identify with that suffering. It makes them overwhelmed. And when that happens, when people are in positions of caregiving, whether professionally or at home, and then they're constantly hyper aware and affected by other people's suffering, that's not good. So this increase in amygdala response, again, depending on the context, that may be a bad thing.
So they can be maladaptive or adaptive.
Yeah, it could be maladaptive or adaptive, depending on the context, depending on other things that are going on, and people's own the way they relate to their own emotions, for example. Like, we don't know if having a strong amygdala activation, how does that feel? Does that always feel good or bad or this or that? Like, aren't there more subtleties than that? You would hope that in the human experience, there's more degrees of subtlety to what we feel than is my amygdala on or off. And I think so. I think it's much more subtle than that. Okay, so just to wrap it up here, I mentioned we measured heart rate during the brain scans, and in particular we looked at resting heart rate variability, or HRV, which is a measure of autonomic flexibility. Some people think it has to do with vagal tone, which is the level of activation of the vagus nerve. So there's a whole literature on that. And in short, it's good for you if your resting heart rate variability is high. That's associated with better outcomes from cardiovascular disease, including mortality. People who have low heart rate variability and who have heart conditions tend to die faster. So there's some real health correlations to that. But here in this context, we found that after the intervention, resting heart rate variability increased in some of the subjects, and it was linked to a decrease in depression score. And that's consistent with what is known in the literature, that people with depression tend to have low heart rate variability, and then it tends to increase again when they recover from depression. So there's a link between these things, and here we see it after the intervention. Here there's a significant correlation between these two when you lump the two meditation groups together. So each one on its own doesn't reach significance, but taken together, you see that the people who experienced a greater decrease in depression also experienced a greater increase in heart rate variability. Okay, so to wrap it up here, these results add to evidence from previous studies. So I mentioned a couple of previous papers that looked at beginner meditators and found that there was lower amygdala activation in response to emotional stimuli as they were meditating, as they were instructed to meditate inside the scanner. And also in experienced meditators, a study from Richie Davidson's lab found lower amygdala activation in response to emotional stimuli when they were in a meditative state of mindful attention. Interestingly, the same group found that there was higher amygdala activation when experienced meditators were practicing non-referential compassion. So this is in line with our finding that maybe compassion training and compassion meditation is associated with actually an increase in amygdala response. So in our case, we found that in beginners and even when they were not meditating. So we think there's some interesting things going on here. So I'm done with this. I just would like to thank all my collaborators on these studies, especially Chuck, who designed the big compassion attention longitudinal meditation study, and Gaelie Tenzin Negi, who designed the training itself, and then all these people have been involved in one way or another. And this is our funding. So thank you all very much for your attention. Thank you. So I'm open for questions. If you want to leave, you can leave. It's, yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong. The bystander effect is the only behavioral study you did, right? The
Yes.
bystander effect at the very beginning.
Right.
So I'm trying to interpret what actually that study is telling us. So I'm wondering, because I'm still trying to understand why meditation is helping people to become more compassionate.
Mm-hmm.
So my understanding is that they get the meditation get people more connected to their own feelings.
Mm-hmm.
So in this bystander effect, when other people are not responding, you are more true to your own feeling, and you know that I want to help. So it's like fighting against bystander effect,
Mm-hmm.
fighting against not knowing that you need to be compassionate. So that predicts that if you don't have this bystander effect, if you are really there by yourself, there's no difference between meditation and meditation. Is that possible? Because there are two different explanations for the same effect.
That's a very good suggestion, that if we did this setup without the bystander effect, with only one person waiting one seat, would we or would we not find changes after meditation training? That would be a great way to disentangle these two aspects. That's a great suggestion. That's a project. There's other mechanisms that could potentially be at play here. One of them is becoming more aware of one's surrounding. It's also completely possible that before training, people are so distracted and so either mind wandering or doing something on their cell phone that they don't even notice someone coming in on crutches. Another potential effect is that the people who were in the meditation training, they had spent the whole 8 weeks with a group. Maybe they made new friends. They met with a teacher. So they had like an enhanced experience of prosociality in that sense. So that may have bled into them having this more prosocial behavior afterwards. And in the absence of a control group, in which they would have the same group and expectation effect, but not the meditation training, it's impossible to disentangle here. So there's several limitations like that in that pilot study. So we don't know the mechanisms at all. We can only observe that after meditation training, there was a strong increase in likelihood to give up one seat, but the mechanisms through which that happened are still completely unknown. So further studies will be able to disentangle that. I like your idea of having one without the bystander effect and see if the effect remains or not. That's great. Yes?
With the longitudinal neuroimaging study, you show like an overall positive effect. But I was wondering if you looked at any other sources of individual difference, if you have any like genotypes or age or gender, any other socioeconomic status variables, like if you're seeing anything that mediates the effects.
Yeah, very interesting. So in terms of age and gender, we did look at that, and there was no correlation there, no mediation effects. In terms of other assessments, we do have those data. They're still in the process of being investigated. So there's inflammation data, response to the Trier social stress test, baseline levels of cortisol, IL-6, CRP, etc., and so on. So there's more to it, hopefully, that we will discover as soon as these data are now analyzed. Yeah.
In the Crutches study, did you have some people who were of different races and see if there was a difference in response within that cohort as well?
So in which study, I'm sorry?
In the response to people, somebody coming in with crutches.
Oh, yes,
Study.
very good question.
For race response.
That was not part of the experimental setup. I believe all the Confederates, well, first of all, they were all female, I know that. I think they were all Caucasian, but I'm not 100% sure. In terms of the participants, I don't know their background, but the study being so small, we probably wouldn't have had the statistical power to look at these effects, unfortunately. So one would need to design a study specifically for that question and power it accordingly and then look at these effects. I know other people have looked into things like this a little bit. Yuna Kang from here, right, had a paper looking at, after loving kindness meditation training, how people's implicit biases towards some populations did or did not change. So she found, I think, effects in terms of SES, so response to homeless people, improved after the loving kindness meditation training. I'm not sure she found any racial effects, but I'm sure you guys would know better because I don't remember on top of my head. But that's a great question, and that's something that needs to be investigated.
And then that north-south.
Yeah. Right, they should do it in Atlanta too and see. Yeah.
This is great.
I think
more questions?
maybe one more. Yeah.
So I'm very fascinated by this idea that meditation can help with compassion. I think it's counterintuitive to me because in meditation you sit there alone, and that helps you with pro-social behavior, which is reacting to other people. So I wonder whether it's the most direct way to train people to be compassionate. For example, I know that the acting professor at Brown, Laurie Marshall, she provided an improv workshop to medical students to help them with empathy and stuff. So in improv, people directly interact with each other, and that might be able to help them with empathy, more empathetic, and maybe more compassionate. So I'm just trying to understand whether it is a direct way to go to being compassionate, or it's going somewhere and finally arrive there.
That's a great question. I'm sure there are many other types of interventions that can be helpful to improve compassionate behavior. I think the features of these types of contemplative-based practices is that it includes working on oneself first. And I think that's an important first step because otherwise we tend to always do the same kind of habitual things and the way we interact with people and the way we respond to certain situations. And I think with contemplative practices, we have an opportunity to face that and kind of observe these patterns with a little bit more insight. And that can be helpful, especially when it comes to dealing with suffering, which kind of pushes everyone's buttons always in one way or another. So I think it adds some interesting piece to it, that it makes people maybe more, I don't know, like spacious, as they would describe it in contemplative traditions, feeling like they have the mental strength to deal with the situation and be okay in the middle of chaos, or things like that, which other interventions that would be more externally oriented may not tap into that necessarily. But I also think that different people are going to relate to different types of things. And that's also an active topic in this field, is like, who does this type of training benefit the most? And who may actually not get anything from it or potentially get worse? And so that's a very important question also. Are we giving this to the right people? And you may find that there is a type of population for which an improv-based intervention is much more helpful than a meditation-based intervention. These are empirical questions. Again, it's things that we should investigate and find out.
Do you want to do one last question?
Okay.
Well, how long do these effects last for?
That's another great question. The problem is,
Could you repeat the question?
the question is, how long do these effects last? Because we measure it immediately after the end of the intervention, and then we don't know what happens. And that's typical in the field, that there's not much follow-up beyond that. It's usually for very pragmatic reasons. Until we demonstrate immediate effects, we're not going to get the funding to do long-term studies. So now that there is some preliminary, data that accumulates that finds short-term effects, maybe the time is right to start applying for grants for long-term effects. But maybe it's still too early. I don't know. So, yeah, that would be great to do, but it hasn't happened yet.
Well, thank you very much, Gal, and everybody. Will you be available just to answer questions?
Sure.
People want
Absolutely.
to thoughts and questions. It's great. It's very exciting work.
Thank you.